The Soulsborne series, or franchise, whatever you want to call it, are known for their insane difficulty, whether it's a super challenging level design with some questionable enemy placements, the traps, and most infamously their bosses. These, coupled in with some other interesting mechanics, are what makes the Souls games challenging, but also the reason why they're so popular to this day. Because of this, I've always asked myself, out of all the 7 Souls games, which one is truly the hardest? Is it Dark Souls 1 with its slower paced combat, Elden Ring due to the super fast paced bosses, or Sekiro due to its difficult learning curve? Well, we'll find out in this video, but before I get into the ranking, if you like content like this, be sure to like and subscribe, and if you don't want to do that, then that's fine by me. I also have a Discord and Patreon, so if you're interested in that, I'll talk about them in more details at the end of this video. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight to the ranking. At number 7 we have Demon Souls. It's no surprise that Demon Souls is the easiest out of all the Souls games. I mean, it was the first one after all. However, despite it being the easiest, it still has its fair share of hard moments, whether it's with the bosses, the slower paced combat, and the level design. Let's start with the level design. The level design of Demon Souls is actually the hardest part of the game. The levels are super linear but at the same time filled to the brim with enemies. Now, the enemy density is not as bad as Dark Souls 2, but they're still what makes traversal really difficult. Also, there's a lot of narrow pathways which makes swinging your big sword around pretty difficult at times. Pause, because your weapon will bounce off the walls. Another thing about the level design that's somewhat a pain to deal with is the fact that you can get locked out of getting different items or weapons due to the black and white tendency system. You see, the tendency system works in a weird way because basically if you die too much in human form in a specific area before killing a boss, then your tendency goes from white to black. Some weapons such as a Dragon Bone Smasher can only be obtained if you have pure white tendency, as it's blocked by some rebels if you don't. The hardest levels in the game were the Valley of Defilement and the Shrine of Storms. I swear I had a headache traversing through these areas, especially on the road to the old hero. Another thing that can make traversal a bit difficult is the lack of checkpoints. You see, Demon Souls doesn't have checkpoints like the other titles, as the only way to reach another one is by defeating a boss. And speaking about bosses, let's talk about the ones we have here. The bosses are the easiest part of the games, especially compared to the bosses in later Souls games. I mean, most of them can be cheesed pretty easily, and not only that, their moveset is somewhat basic and easy to deal with. Now, to be fair, a lot of the bosses are gimmicky, but even then, they're still pretty easy to deal with. The quote-unquote hardest bosses in the games were King Alon, Flame Lurker, and Man-Eaters, and they're not necessarily hard, again, especially compared to the modern Souls games, because I didn't struggle against any of them, except maybe Man-Eaters, and to be fair, they're a pretty janky fight. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is the gameplay and combat. The overall gameplay of Demon Souls is rather slow, but for some reason it felt smoother than Dark Souls 2. But to be fair, I did play the remake for Demon Souls that came out back in 2020, and Dark Souls 2 was released back in 2014, so it's kind of a bit unfair to compare both of them. But again, the gameplay and combat is rather slow, but it definitely doesn't take too long to get used to. Since we're on the topic of gameplay, let's talk about the healing. The healing is what makes this game super easy as well, as you can hold up to 50 of 3 or 4 different healing items that comes in the form of weed, instead of the usual 14 or 15 flasks. And they're a common drop, so you will stock up on these in no time. So overall, all of those things I've mentioned are the reason why I think that Demon Souls is the easiest out of all the Souls games. Now at 6th place we have Dark Souls 1. So around a month ago I played through the whole game of Dark Souls 1, and what I realized was that it was way easier than I remembered. Now to be fair, I did use the Black Knight sword, which is one of the most powerful weapons in the game, but even then, before that, I was using the Claymore and I was still breezing through it. Now let's start with the gameplay. Dark Souls 1's gameplay, much like Demon Souls, is a bit slow paced, and the most challenging thing to get used to is combat wise is the lock-on. You see, the game doesn't use the same omnidirectional lock-on roll like the other Souls games. Instead, if you're locked onto an enemy, you can only dodge in 4 directions, which can definitely throw off many players. However, because of this, it's best to stay locked off during a fight so you can have free movement. Now let's move on to the healing. Dark Souls, much like the other Souls games that came after, uses the standard replenishing healing system, which means unlike Demon Souls or Bloodborne, you don't have to go out your way to farm heals. But it doesn't just stop there. You can also kindle a specific bonfire until you can carry 20 flasks, which is crazy. Again, other than Bloodborne and Demon Souls, no other Souls games allows you to carry that much heals. This definitely makes the game way easier, as most times after killing a boss, you will have a decent amount of Estus remaining. Now let's talk about the level design. This is the main thing a lot of people praise Dark Souls 1 for. You see, the levels in Dark Souls 1 are interconnected, which makes traversing the world immersive. However, this can make it a bit easier to get lost in, especially due to the scarce amount of bonfires in the levels and the lack of fast travel until mid-game. There's also a lot of enemies in each of these levels, so dying to them can be a bit of a pain because you have to traverse a long way in order to get back your souls. And speaking about the runbacks, the Bed of Chaos and Seath runback are literally the worst. Like, what were the devs thinking? Running back to those bosses took like 2 minutes, which is insane. Moving on to the bosses. The bosses in the games were definitely a bit harder than Demon Souls, but they are nothing to worry about. The only somewhat hard ones are the DLC bosses, especially Monos and Notorious. You see, they both move around so much, which makes fighting them a bit more difficult, especially since the combat of Dark Souls 1 is slow. But they're still no way as hard as some of the other bosses in the later games. So overall, due to the level design being a bit less linear, Dark Souls ranks above Demon Souls in terms of difficulty, but on the other hand, due to most of the bosses being pushovers and the generous healing system, it only ranks in 6th place. Dark Souls 2. Now let me just get this out of the way. In terms of bosses, I think that Dark Souls 2 is super easy. The only real exception to this are Sauron, Fume Knight, and Ancient Dragon. However, what makes these bosses difficult isn't their inherent design or mechanics, but rather the super slow paced combat of the game. Despite Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls being released before Dark Souls 2, the combat and overall gameplay feeling of Dark Souls 2 is significantly slower. I've said this multiple times and I still stand by it. Dark Souls 2 is literally the slowest paced Souls game in the entire series. For all the people who claim that the combat in Dark Souls 2 is better than the one in Dark Souls 1, I have to disagree because in my opinion, the combat feels way too floaty in Dark Souls 2. When I compare the bosses in Dark Souls 2 to those in other Souls games, it's clear that most of them are easier to handle. The reason behind this ease is the simplicity of the strategies required to defeat them. For the vast majority of bosses in Dark Souls 2, all you need to do is strafe to the side and attack. This straightforward approach works for almost every encounter, which can definitely make the game feel way less challenging, especially compared to the others. Take for example the Ruined Sentinels or the Dragon Rider. These bosses might seem difficult at first since you're fighting them in super tight areas, but once you understand the basic mechanics, they become trivial. Strafe to the side, dodge your telegraphed attacks, and get a few hits in. Repeat this process and you'll find yourself victorious in no time. However, I do want to give credit where it's due. The DLC bosses in Dark Souls 2 such as Sauron and Fume Knight are exceptions. These fights are well designed and provide a significant challenge, largely due to their more complex attack patterns. These encounters feel more similar to the intense battles found in other entries of the series. The Ancient Dragon is another exception, but for different reasons. This fight is less about skill and more about patience and understanding the boss's attack patterns. The Ancient Dragon's massive health pool and high damaging attacks requires a cautious approach, making it one of the few bosses in Dark Souls 2 that can be genuinely challenging. Now in terms of level design, this is the toughest part of the game. In almost every corner of each level there is a gang of enemies waiting to kill you. I swear sometimes I'll get down taking out an entire mob of enemies thinking that I'm safe, only to see another one jump out the corner. This is definitely the most annoying part of Dark Souls 2, which, speaking of annoying, the worst area in the entire game has to go to Shrine of Amarna. Who came up with this shit and thought it was a good idea? Look, if you want to hear my opinion on Dark Souls 2, I did make a video like 2 years ago talking about its flaws and what it could have done better, but it's an old video, so don't expect the best quality. But overall, the bosses in Dark Souls 2 were super easy for the most part, but it's the level design that made it rank above the previous 2 entries. And to this day, I still think that Dark Souls 2 has the hardest level design in Souls history. At 4th place we have Dark Souls 3. Now we're getting to the more difficult games. Dark Souls 3 finds itself in the middle in terms of difficulty. The bosses are definitely harder for sure, especially the DLC ones, and they're on par with the bosses from the Souls games I've yet to mention. The level design, while not being difficult when it comes on to traversal, definitely has a few enemies here and there that will make you question if it's even worth fighting them. But before I speak on the difficulty of the bosses and level design, let's start with the gameplay. The overall gameplay of Dark Souls 3 is fast paced and simple, so in terms of accessibility for newcomers, it's the best choice. Now in terms of the healing system, the main healing item you use is the Estus Flask. However, this time you can only have up to 15 of them, which is the same amount you can have in Dark Souls 2, except in that game you can also carry healing gems. This definitely makes the healing a bit harder for the players because unlike Dark Souls 1, you can't just kindle a bonfire all the way up to 20. You instead have to go out your way and find bone and Estus shards in order to upgrade your flasks. Now the level design of the game is pretty linear as you have one main path and another branching path that takes you to an optional area of a level. Because of this, you don't have to worry about getting lost. There's also a lot of bonfires in each of the levels, which kind of became a meme in the community due to how close some of these bonfires were to each other. Now overall, the bosses were definitely the hardest part of the game, especially on your first ever playthrough. However, on subsequent playthroughs, you'll realize that they're way easier than the ones in Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. Well, at least the main game ones, because the DLC bosses in Dark Souls 3 are on par with a lot of the late game bosses of the games I've just mentioned. But all in all, I think Dark Souls 3 deserves this spot in terms of difficulty. At number 3 we have Bloodborne. Bloodborne is for sure one of the most challenging entries in the Soulsborne series, and I rank it as the third hardest game in the lineup. One of the primary reasons for its difficulty is the game's aggressive combat mechanics and bosses. Unlike the Dark Souls series where players can rely on blocking, Bloodborne encourages a more fast-paced approach to combat. This change in combat dynamics mean that players must adapt to a style that prioritizes quick reflexes, precise timing, and continuous pressure on enemies. The aggressive nature of combat in Bloodborne is shown by the game's bosses. From the very beginning, players are thrust into intense battles that demand a deep understanding of the game's mechanic. For example, the Cleric Beast and Father Gascoigne, two of the early bosses that set the tone for what players can expect throughout their journey. These encounters are fast, brutal, and leave little room for error. Bosses like Ludwig, the Orphan of Cause, and Lady Maria also pushes players to their limits with their swift, unpredictable attack patterns and crazy damage output. Basically in Bloodborne, you have to stay on the offensive while also monitoring your stamina, which can definitely be a bit challenging. In addition to the challenging combat and bosses, Bloodborne's level design is another reason why the game can be a bit harder than the others at times. The game features a more linear progression compared to its predecessors, but the areas and levels have a lot of tough enemies in them. Locations like the Nightmare of Mensis and the Fishing Hamlet are filled with enemies that can quickly overwhelm even the most experienced players. The Winter Lanterns with their frenzy attacks and the Sharks in the Fishing Hamlet with their sheer power and aggression are prime examples of the enemies that can turn a manageable situation into a deadly encounter. Navigating these areas require not only skill but also a deep understanding of enemy patterns and environmental hazards. Another layer of difficulty in Bloodborne arises from the game's reliance on blood gems to enhance weapon performance. Blood gems are not to be confused with bloodstones, as the latter is what you use to do your basic upgrades, but if you want to make sure your weapon is even more powerful, you can also add blood gems to them. While these blood gems can significantly increase a player's damage output and provide other beneficial effects, obtaining high quality blood gems is definitely not easy. In order to get them, players must delve into the Chalice dungeons and face tough enemies and bosses in order to get them. The randomness of the gem drops means that players need to invest a lot of time and effort into farming the right gems, adding another layer of challenge to the game. Now, the healing system in Bloodborne is a bit more forgiving than Dark Souls 3, as on average you can carry up to 20 blood vials, but with certain runes equipped you can carry up to 32, which is definitely crazy because you don't even need to upgrade their effectiveness. But at the same time, you do have to farm or buy these blood vials, as they are not replenishable like the traditional Estus. In summary, Bloodborne earned its reputation as one of the hardest Soulsborne games due to its relentless combat, challenging bosses, demanding levels, and the difficulty of obtaining high quality blood gems. Coming in at second place for hardest Souls games, we have Elden Ring. Placing Elden Ring at second place was a bit hard for me because I personally think it's the hardest Souls game for sure, but then again, I do know that the reason why I had such a hard time at first, especially on my first playthrough, was because I wasn't really using any summons. Without summons, Elden Ring would have definitely been number one for sure. Let's talk about the level design. This is definitely the most forgiving part of the game since it's open world, and sure, this means it's a lot easier to get lost in, but if you aren't rushing through the game, then that isn't really an issue because if you continue playing, you'll eventually end up on the right path. But the main reason why I say the open level design of the game is the most forgiving is because if a player gets stuck on a certain boss, all they have to do is explore some more. you know, get some more upgrade materials and kill some other side bosses to get some runes to level up. There are even certain areas and enemy layouts that were definitely made for farming. I mean, there's a big ass sleeping dragon that drops around 70k runes if you kill it, and you can reach it pretty early on in the game. And sure, most of the previous entries have farming areas, but Elden Ring has a lot more. Now in terms of other mechanics, Elden Ring has tools such as the Omen Barn, but let's be honest, they're kinda ass. But the best tools are the spirit summons. When fully upgraded, these will make the game go from super challenging to somewhat easy. But don't get me wrong, there are some summons that are absolutely useless, like garbage. But others such as Teach and Mimic Tear are really OP. Especially Mimic Tear. It's basically summoning another version of you, but it gets twice the amount of health, probably even more, and it does a decent amount of damage too. What makes these summons great is the fact that they don't make bosses have more health like traditional NPC boss summons. Speaking about bosses, let's talk about the ones here. Now I did mention earlier that Elden Ring has the hardest bosses in the entire Souls series. The reason being is the fact that you have guys in the main game like Malekith, Malenia, Fire Giant, and in the DLC you have bosses such as Mesmer, Rellana, and let's not forget Prime Consort Radahn, who is literally the hardest Souls boss in my opinion. The bosses in the game are extremely fast paced and they barely leave any room for you to attack, and that's even more common in the DLC. Speaking about the DLC, it even has its own level up system different from the main game. So now you have to go around collecting Shadow Tree fragments in order to level up. So it's not like you can just get super over leveled in the main game and steamroll the DLC, because without fragments, your character, no matter what level you are, will still get two-shotted by most of the bosses. So overall, Elden Ring is pretty hard, but due to the fact that you can farm late game areas pretty early on, and also obtain super early but OP weapons and abilities, I have to put it at second place. Now the hardest Souls game for new players is definitely going to be Sekiro. And yes, Sekiro is a Souls game. I mean, it follows some of the core mechanics of the other Souls titles but with its own spin. So yeah, I just wanted to get that off my chest because some people genuinely believe that Sekiro isn't a Souls game. That aside, Sekiro was the only Souls game that I actually quit due to how hard it was at first. Yeah, get your laughs in, whatever bro. Now mind you, this was many years ago and I was playing the game like it was Dark Souls. Plus I also didn't know how to deflect. For some reason, I thought when the game asked me to deflect, I had to press the block button, which obviously isn't the case. And this was because as a kid, I refused to read the tutorials in a lot of games. But fast forward a year later, I decided to give the game another try and I had a way better time, because this time I actually read the tutorial message. Now let's talk about the reason why a lot of people struggled with Sekiro at first. The combat. The combat in Sekiro takes some time to get used to. At first it's kinda hard to read the enemy attack patterns, and most time you will either parry too early or too late, which can be crucial because 1. Enemies hit super hard, and 2. Deflection is the main mechanic of Sekiro, so knowing how to deflect properly is something you need to get good at. But while Sekiro has a somewhat difficult learning curve, after you understand it, it becomes one of the easier Souls games. Now let's move on to the level design. In terms of level design, Sekiro isn't crazy hard or anything. The only hard part is trying to figure out where to go after killing Genichiro, and the occasional mini bosses guarding an area. And speaking about bosses, the bosses are another reason why this game ranks super high. For newcomers, most of these bosses are going to feel somewhat impossible, especially Ishin, Father Owl, and Demon of Hatred, since they have a lot of phases and they are super fast and also have a complex moveset. And Sekiro isn't like a game where you can just farm and level up your character, as the only way to do that is by collecting prayer beads for health and defeating the main bosses for attack power. So in order to beat Sekiro, you literally have to get good. And another thing, you can't even change your build. So because of the lack of build variety and the high skill ceiling, I place Sekiro at number 1 for being the hardest Souls game, at least for new players. If you guys enjoyed this video, then hit the like button and subscribe. If you don't want to do that, then that's fine by me. If you want a place to talk about Soulsborne content or maybe just any other type of content, you can check out my Discord. It's in the description. And finally, if you want to show more support, then you can check out my Patreon. There you get access to early videos before they release. You can also recommend a different video idea of your choice. Again, only do this if you want to, because I'm not forcing you. You being here is good enough. Also, shout out to my Patreon members, NoHo Seb, Frank Holos, Hugh Nguyen, and the paid member Jabroni Jones. Thank you all for the support, and yeah, that's the end of the video. Hope you guys have a good one.